But if you have a national policy where women can just, get on a telemedicine call, be prescribed an abortion, have the abortion drugs mailed right to their home, and then they take the abortion drugs right in the privacy of their own home, you don't really have pro-life state laws.
Welcome to Matters of Soul Importance, where we dive deeply into topics of both earthly and eternal consequence. I'm Roxanne Solonin, faith columnist and features writer for the Forum, author, and speaker. In my own work writing about the pro-life movement and ministry, I'd become aware of the name Alexandra DeSanctis and was pleased when, in September of last year, our local Shanley High School held an event to raise money for the March for Life in D.C. for their Deacons for Life group and invited Alexandra to speak. I gladly attended and, after her talk, asked if she'd be willing to have a conversation on matters of soul importance about the overturning of Roe v. Wade, the landmark 1973 Supreme Court decision that made abortion legal throughout our land, and the effects of its reversal. We are still living in that aftermath, and it seems the verdict is still out on whether it actually helped the pro-life cause. In many ways, it seemed to only bring more division and confusion. From the perspective of a local sidewalk advocate who prays regularly for an end to an abortion, hoping to redirect abortion-minded people from choosing this lethal way of addressing unplanned pregnancy, I and other advocates have seen some positive effects, but it also seems that society is clamoring all the more loudly for abortion as an option, and recent studies have shown an increase in abortion in recent years. Additionally, with abortion pill options now more widely available, abortion seems a more accessible option than ever. What's the truest undercurrent? Have we, in successfully seeing Roe v. Wade overturned, created a better situation? Is this something that just takes time, or did the overturning of Roe only make matters worse? How can we approach this thoughtfully and with hope? If anyone can bring hope into this realm, it's Alexandra DeSanctis. So let's meet her now. Welcome to Matters of Soul Importance. Alexandra, how are you doing this morning?
I'm doing very well, Roxanne. Good to be with you.
Definitely. Well, we met a while back and got this all scheduled, and I didn't even know about your book until recently. It came while I was out of town. So I have it here in front of me, and I'm really wanting to dive in, but I wasn't able to do it before this conversation. So hopefully you can summarize a little bit of it for us as we go along. But before we go into the meat, which is, did the fall of Roe help or hurt the pro-life cause? That's what we're going to be asking today. I always like to get a little sense of who my guests are, and doing a little research, I saw a description that you had that was on the Ethics and Public Policy Center website where you were working at the time. It was from a National Review editor who called you one of the most fearless journalists in America, adding that you were a dogged, factual, and principled journalist. So I want to hear more about how that came to be, Alexandra. So why don't you jump in and share a little bit about your background, your childhood, just a little bit, and then how you ended up doing what the work that you have done with pro-life and abortion and those kinds of topics.
Sure. Well, thank you again so much for having me. It's great to be here for this conversation. And I'm very grateful to my former boss, Rich Lowry, for those glowing words that you just quoted. I got my start in journalism thanks to him. He hired me right out of college 10 years ago now, which feels like quite, yesterday and a long time at the same time.
Right.
But I went to Notre Dame for undergrad, and I was always interested in politics on some level, but first and foremost, always really wanted to be a writer from a very young age. I grew up in a Catholic household, grew up loving reading and writing, and very, very conservative household. And right out of college, just figured that going into journalism was a great way to kind of blend my political science study with my love of writing, and just sort of find my way in that world a little bit and see if it worked out. And so my first job was at National Review on kind of a postgrad fellowship, and it ended up really being a great fit. I was there full time for 6 years, and I still write there pretty regularly, both for the magazine and the website. And it was just a great first home for me as a writer. It really, they gave me a lot of freedom to pursue writing whatever I was interested in. And there were already some great writers there, writing about the pro-life issue in particular. Catherine Jean Lopez would be one example, or Ramesh Ponnuru. But no one was really covering it as an everyday kind of beat, I would say. And so because it's a cause I've always really cared about, I kind of naturally gravitated to writing more about it. And the more I wrote about it, the more I learned and the more of an expert I became. And it was kind of this self-reinforcing prophecy almost. So I didn't really intend to become like an abortion policy expert, so to speak, or someone who wrote full time about the pro-life movement, but it was just always very close to my heart. And when you have a job, when you're writing every single day, you kind of, you're given that sort of freedom. You just kind of end up writing about the stuff you care about most. And so for me, that ended up being the pro-life cause.
Absolutely. And even though I haven't gone into it as much as you have, it is a common topic for me to cover. I am not liked very often by our local abortion escorts who read some of my material and hear some of my podcasts, but it is something that's so dear to my heart too. What was it though that drove you to that topic of all topics? Because most people will run from this topic. What was it that wooed you in and kept you focused on abortion?
That's the kind of question you would think somebody who's done this for many years has kind of like a lightning bolt moment answer to, right? I certainly didn't grow up thinking I was going to write about abortion policy. I've always been pro-life as long as I can remember. I don't, though, honestly, even remember the moment I found out what abortion is. I just remember I've always, for as long as I've known that abortion existed, I've had a very strong pull in my heart to do something about it. It just feels like once you know that this is out there, it can't be something that you sit on the sidelines for. And not everybody, of course, is supposed to be a reporter writing about it or even necessarily pray outside an abortion clinic or whatever. We all have different ways of contributing. But I feel very strongly that once you see this grave evil for what it is, you can't ignore it. We can't live a life that pretends this isn't happening. And so for me, the shape that took just ended up being I went into journalism and had a lot of freedom to write. And it happened to be something that no one was covering. In journalism in particular, when you're a young voice and when you're in opinion journalism, it's very easy to kind of try to pile onto the issues that everyone else is talking about. And, at the time that was Donald Trump's candidacy or, various other hot button political topics. And I kind of wanted to carve out a niche where fewer people were writing on it. And at the time, I think since then, certainly, and since the fall of Roe, which we'll get to, abortion has become a much more popular topic. But 10 years ago, not so much. It was more of a niche issue, and covering the pro-life movement wasn't something a lot of people at National Review were doing, certainly not full time. And so it just kind of, I guess it was serendipity in a sense, or providence, if you want to put it that way, that my passion kind of aligned with where I found myself.
Do you think your age had anything to do? I mean, I guess I'm curious where your peers are at on this topic, and obviously depends on what sphere you're in. But do you feel like because your generation escaped abortion, like you could have been aborted because you were born? I was born in 1968, so I was right before the 1973 decision. Do you think that has impacted your generation in terms of being really enlightened about this topic and really like it's a personal matter? Because it could have been you. Has that shaped it at all?
From what I've seen and all the conversation I've had on this topic, I think for most people, it's really more a matter of the ultrasound and technology. And I know that certainly predates my lifetime, but just sort of the pervasiveness of ultrasound images. I think it's very rare now to hear somebody sincerely think that the unborn child isn't a human being. And so you might have debates over whether it's a person or whether the woman's rights are more important or all those other kind of second line issues. But I think people my age, if they're pro-life, it's because they're very convinced of the scientific fact of human life in the womb. And I think that's a much more, it's kind of silly almost now to try and pretend that this isn't a human being.
Right. There's a lot of kind of silly arguments because when you bring logic into this, it doesn't make any sense. But I talked to someone once on the sidewalk that I believe was a worker in our local facility, and she tried to convince me that the child wasn't alive until it was birthed. So, there's a lot of things floating around. Well, you know what? I want to maybe jump in sooner than I normally do to the topic because I think it's so important. And I'm really curious about your perspective. You were still madly writing articles about this topic when Roe v. Wade fell. Can you just share a little bit about how you were perceiving that and just from your perspective, what all was happening, and ultimately we want to ask, was this a good thing? Was it a bad thing? Where are we at? So, but I want to hear your perspective as that was happening. What were you seeing? What were you observing at that time?
Yeah, well, I'll say a few things about that. The first is you mentioned my book, which is called Tearing Us Apart. I co-wrote it with Ryan Anderson, and we conceived of the idea for the book before, of course, we knew the outcome in Dobbs. And the book came out 4 days after the Supreme Court overturned Roe. So it really couldn't have been
Wow.
better planned in terms of the timing. And I remember when we were putting the proposal together, we actually only submitted the proposal in the fall of 2021. And the publisher that we ended up going with, which was Regnery, at the time, Regnery, they wanted us to write the book, but they said, we really want to try and time this to come out next summer, because everybody knew that was when sometime around the summer, Dobbs would likely be coming out. And so they thought that would be a great boost for sales. And so we wrote the book extremely quickly. It took us, I think we signed the contract maybe in October, and we submitted the first draft of the manuscript in late January of 2022. So that's all to answer the question. I was very absorbed in the topic, in a very high intensity way leading up to Dobbs. And it really paid off in the sense that the timing couldn't have been better. And we were able to promote the book at the same time as we were doing a lot of media, just talking about the fact that Roe had been overturned. And of course, we were hoping and praying and looking at the composition of the court, thinking probably the book would come out in a post-Roe America, but we didn't know for sure. And for me, it was especially gratifying because, like I said, I'd spent the beginning of my career at that point, I guess 5 years, covering this issue in a climate where people didn't really want to talk about it. I would go and give talks on college campuses for, little groups of 20 Catholic students, for example. It was not, of course, abortion's always been a hot button issue, but it wasn't in the political bloodstream the way it has been since Dobbs. And so for it to suddenly be something that everybody was talking about, everybody cared about, and here I was with this expertise I'd been kind of, studiously carving away at for years was very gratifying to be able to contribute in that way.
Yeah. What did make you brave enough to step into those spheres and take on this topic, which is so divisive? And what was your approach in that?
I think what I tried to do early on, and this is maybe, I don't know if in your audience there are people thinking of going into journalism or perhaps with children or grandchildren who might be interested in that. But I always give the advice of really develop expertise and know what you're talking about. Don't go into journalism as a young person, just giving your opinion on everything. And so my approach was really to develop expertise and to do a lot of really serious reporting on the topic, to read a lot of books on the topic, to talk to experts as much as I could, to really learn about what Roe v. Wade actually was, what it said, what the dissent said, understand the topic from all these different angles, because then what you're writing is actually valuable to people. You're not just kind of throwing out your hot takes and moving on. You're having real substance to offer. And I think putting in that time early on, just out of, interest and a desire to be contributing in a meaningful way, that really bolstered my later work in a way I couldn't have anticipated.
Can you, if you would, step back and go into some of those bullet points of the things that you were learning that maybe weren't really being discussed, and you were able to bring light to the topic? What are some of those topics that came up? Some of those definitive moments that you realized this is something I can offer.
Well, I remember early on, one of the very first pieces I wrote, I showed up in the summer of 2016. So like I said, that was when the Trump candidacy was the big thing everyone was talking about. And I remember spending a lot of time writing about those, some of the Planned Parenthood undercover videos that the Center for Medical Progress released about the fetal trafficking, or the trafficking of fetal body parts from aborted babies that Planned Parenthood had been doing. And this was something that, as you probably remember, pro-lifers were very up in arms about, but no one else was really paying attention to. And so a lot of my early pieces were either tracking some of those videos as they came out, or tracking the different investigations into Planned Parenthood that came about as a result of those videos. So whether or not there was going to be any criminal charges for Planned Parenthood, how that all shook out. And I remember spending a lot of time digging into very thick documents about all of it. I didn't want to just give my opinion. I wanted to really dig in and understand what was in the videos, what people were saying about it, what was being turned up in these investigations. And I learned a lot doing that, because it's difficult work to figure out what's actually true, what's being said, what's really on the video. And it's also gruesome. And I think I learned early on that, especially as a person of faith, you have to really guard your eyes and your heart in a sense. And some of us are called to look at these sorts of evil things, but it's very easy to give into despair when you spend, all day doing this sort of work. And so I had to really learn that early on, that there was a balance to find there. But that's just one example I can think of. I did a lot on policy too. Things like, the fight over the partial birth abortion ban from the 90s and early 2000s. I did a lot of research on that early on, just kind of trying to learn the history of the issue and how it was playing out at the time too.
Why don't you talk about the Center for Medical Progress situation, because he recently was exonerated, right? And is that pretty much a closed? But you don't hear a lot about it.
Yeah, it's been dragging on now for more than 10 years. So it's been quite a saga, and there have been investigations on both sides. So you had, Republican lawmakers looking into Planned Parenthood as a result of what was uncovered in the videos. But then on the flip side, of course, Planned Parenthood and these different abortion clinics that David Daleiden and his associates were, recording undercover, then sued the pro-life activists to try and punish them, silence them, try to keep the video footage from ever coming out, or more of the video footage from coming out, because it made Planned Parenthood look very bad, of course. And as far as I know, he has been exonerated, but I haven't followed in great detail. It's been going on for a long time now in various courts.
Mm-hmm. And of course, it was interesting because Kamala Harris was involved in that in California. And so then this last presidential election, it was all kind of connected again, all these things. Really briefly, for anyone who doesn't know what that was all about, do you want to just explain with the baby body parts situation, just a little bit about it so people can understand the gravity of what we were watching? Because I remember I have a really good pro-life friend we were watching it together. She lives in Texas. And I remember where I was at in my driveway when we were talking on the phone and it was all coming down, and we just had this moment of grief. Like you said, it's, we're both mothers and have been heavily involved in the topic. And it was just the moment where we had to pull back and just cry and just let ourselves feel what this really was. Because it's like you have a sense of things, but then when it comes up, this darkness comes to the light, it's devastating to really take it in.
Yeah, absolutely. So in brief, basically what happened was there's a group of pro-life journalists and activists who went undercover as a medical research firm or buyers of human tissue, who went undercover to different Planned Parenthood clinics, talking with Planned Parenthood medical directors across the country, posing as potential buyers of fetal tissue. So Planned Parenthood would sell the body parts of aborted babies to medical researchers, and these particular ones were undercover. They were filming these conversations, recording these conversations, and later releasing parts of them to show that Planned Parenthood was either willing to or would go through with illegally selling the body parts of aborted babies. So it's legal, I think, to donate as long as the mother consents these body parts, but it's not legal for Planned Parenthood to profit, or for an abortion clinic to profit from the body parts. It's not legal to sell them. And so it appeared, and I think recent or subsequent investigations have shown that Planned Parenthood was in fact profiting from these sales. So that was the upshot of what happened. And to your point about being, hit by the reality of it, I think, you asked earlier why this is something that's always captured my heart. And I think it's true. Early on, I always cared about the issue. But when I was in college, there were two big things that happened. One of which was these videos started coming out. And the other was the current Gosnell trial, who was the abortionist, I think, in the Philadelphia area, who actually just recently passed away. But he went to prison for illegally storing various body parts of aborted babies and also killing babies who had been born rather than, while they were still in the womb. And I just remember with that case in particular, it got very little media attention. And just thinking, well, what's so different about what he was doing from a normal abortionist? And if he was killing these babies in the womb, 5 seconds earlier, that's the same human being, right? And yet somehow we all know it's grisly for him to be storing these body parts in jars in his office or whatever it ended up being. It was obviously horrific, but that's what abortion is. And so it really drove home to me that we're living in a culture with a lot of cognitive dissonance around this issue and what human life in the womb really is.
Right, because with the baby body part scandal, you were hearing things casually discussed, like how much, if you could turn the baby a certain way or whatever, you could get more for the brain and the kidneys and whatever. I mean, when this is like the kind of horror that we witnessed in World War II kind of thing, and that people weren't really privy to it. And then the other thing was, once it came out, it was all about, well, they weren't supposed to be taking those videos, though. That was what David Daleiden got in trouble for or whatever. And it's like, okay, so now we've deflected to whether the video, not the truth of what was happening, not these children that were annihilated this way, but whether that was the right, and the truth somehow is just like getting convoluted and yeah, it's a mess and it's devastating. So Roe v. Wade happened, your book's coming out. I personally was elated in the moments when we found out how that was going to go and how it had gone. What was your thought at the time? And then I want to get into what have you seen since then, positive or negative?
Yeah, I mean, I was like you, elated. I mean, like I said, I grew up very pro-life. I always cared about this issue, and again, as a person of faith, would pray for an end to abortion, still do, but I didn't really. I don't think I had fully internalized the possibility that Roe v. Wade might be overturned in my lifetime. It just seemed like this big, immovable object that was the way that it was. That's what America is now. There's no going back, and it's over, and we just have to try, keep trying because it's the right thing to do. But to really imagine, being alive and hearing that the Supreme Court had overturned Roe, I could not have prepared myself mentally for that possibility. And especially to be, working in a field where I was able to write about it, where I had just written a book about the topic, hopefully preparing for a post-Roe America, helping pro-lifers to think through the issue more deeply once abortion could be, illegal in various states or whatever, however it would shake out. And we can get into that. It was just a really powerful moment to see that all that prayer and hard work by pro-lifers that far predated my involvement really bore fruit. And I'm not super optimistic about what we've seen since, unfortunately, on many levels, but I don't think that any of that should just diminish the fact that this was an incredible victory and really was only possible because of that prayer and hard work for decades.
Let's stay in that moment of hope for a moment. Do you remember where you were? Because I remember where I was. Do you remember where you were when you got the news, and what was the atmosphere?
I do. Yeah, I was in my my townhouse. I had gotten married. I guess I'd been married for a little over a year at that point, and my husband and I were both working from home that day. So we were both at home in our townhouse when we read the news. And I think we weren't expecting the decision that day. I think it came out a bit earlier than anyone had been expecting. And we had just had the book party. Actually, my publisher had hosted the book party for our book the night before. And in hindsight, we knew it had been the eve of the fall of Roe book party, which was kind of cool. But yeah, my husband and I were just at home, and we could hardly believe it.
Dancing around the living room.
Yeah, basically. I mean, I think we're kind of in shock, honestly.
Yeah. All right, then we have to move beyond that wonderful moment, because it was absolutely wonderful. I was just so excited, and everyone that I knew, we were texting madly. I was actually at a conference, and not everyone around me was with me, so I had to kind of go off into the corner and have my little celebration quietly. But so that was kind of interesting too. But things quickly began to become a firestorm. So maybe you didn't experience that, but I mean, it was crazy. It was just like something was unleashed. Did you experience that in the aftermath, or did you get to hang on to that euphoria a little bit longer?
No, it very quickly became bad. Now, I will say I spent the next couple of weeks very aggressively promoting the book. So it was it was a harrowing time for many reasons. But I mean, because of that, it really forced me to pay a lot of attention to kind of the media story of the fall of Roe as it unfolded, and both in the context of kind of the national media, and then even on my personal social media, the tenor was as though, women had been cast back into the dark ages. And I remember not really being surprised, because I had been covering this issue and that was always what people said. But just for women that I knew personally to be saying on social media, now women don't have equal rights to men. America is, putting women back to before the times when we could vote, or the tenor was just women are going to die. Women are in trouble. America doesn't care about women. The Supreme Court doesn't care about women. I think we've seen that's the argument that's really carried the day since then.
Yeah. Oh, man. I love the subtitle of your book. So it's Tearing Us Apart, How Abortion Harms Everything and Solves Nothing. Share a little bit about that subtitle. What does that mean? It harms everything and solves nothing. There'd be many that would say, oh, no, no. And what would you say to that?
Yeah. So the argument of the book is basically, if it's true that abortion is the taking of an innocent human life, which I think can be factually, scientifically proven, it's the intentional act that ends the life of a human being in the womb. How could it be possible that this could be a solution, right? Maybe there are situations where a woman is in a difficult spot, or, we all know people who've been in this situation. We know of these situations. There's a lot of suffering in the world. There's a lot of pain. There's a lot of hardship. There are a lot of women who are alone, who don't have the support they need, et cetera. But how could it be true that committing an act of lethal violence against your own child, or, recruiting someone else, I suppose, to commit an act of lethal violence against your child could make you better off, right? If this is a grave, immoral act, this can't really be any kind of solution. So it really starts from that sort of ethical principle that we don't solve problems by committing evils against other innocent human beings. And so the whole book is based on that premise that all of us, our whole society, is worse off if we treat acts of lethal violence against innocent human beings as a solution to our problems. And you could point to a situation perhaps where it looks like abortion made something better, or, eased the burden, or ended the suffering for a time.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't make it certainly right in principle. And no one really is better off for having committed that kind of act, or chosen that kind of act. So that's really the basis of the book is, as pro-lifers, we have to learn to move, start with the fact that this is taking innocent human life, but then also learn how to communicate to people that abortion is harmful to everybody in our whole society, including and especially the mother of the child.
Well, this is not going to go away anytime soon. Just this morning on Facebook, I posted an article. CVS is disputing that they have a tie with Planned Parenthood, but it looks like they want to get into how I phrased it, profiting from the killing of our children. CVS, your local, pharmacy store. So the way I put it, I just, again, I want to raise the consciousness, and I just said, here's your Easter candy, here's your vitamins, and your weapon of destruction of your own child, right? That comes to 56, 67, some random number, I don't know. But anyway, what I'm saying is we're going now possibly into our local CVS, and we can get the weapons of destruction for our own civilization. It just seems very odd to me. What are your thoughts about some of the ongoing issues that are arising? Another one is the proliferation of abortion pill, which is what the CVS aspect comes into, because 2/3 now of children are killed that way in abortion through the pill.
Right. Yeah, I think it's really important that we talk about that because, like you say, a rising number of the abortions in the U.S. every year are chemical abortions. So that's an abortion pill that's taken, early, I think 12 weeks or so, around 12 weeks in the first trimester. And because of policy making during the Biden administration, and that the Trump administration has not reversed, it's now possible for women to obtain abortion drugs without ever seeing a doctor in person, which means that women with ectopic pregnancies, or women whose pregnancies are further along perhaps than they think, are in a very dangerous situation. Now, chemical abortion drugs are dangerous to women, even not in those types of extreme circumstances. But for women to be, pregnant women to be taking chemical abortion drugs at home, never seeing a doctor in person, administering the abortion at home, their child is then passed out of them at home. I'm sorry to have to be graphic about it, but into a toilet. This is how most abortions are happening in the US, and it's impossible to regulate them. And what we were told after Roe is that, well, the issue of abortion is now being given back to the people and their representatives, whether that's at the federal level or the state level. But if you have a national policy where women can just, get on a telemedicine call, be prescribed an abortion, have the abortion drugs mailed right to their home, and then they take the abortion drugs right in the privacy of their own home, you don't really have pro-life state laws. And you might have, maybe 20 or so states have great laws protecting unborn children. That's very much worth celebrating. We couldn't have done that before Roe was overturned. But with this status quo, those laws are very much undermined. And so that's really the status quo right now.
We definitely see how there's the workarounds here, because even before Roe v. Wade fell, we had the one only abortion facility in the state of North Dakota, here in Fargo. And then they stealthily moved across the river. It's just a couple miles to the east, over in Moorhead, Minnesota, where the laws are much different and much more liberal. And so now we have a lot of people a lot of people in North Dakota thought, yay, we're abortion free. Well, no, we aren't actually. All the abortions just went over across the river to Minnesota. And we also see a lot of people from South Dakota. And so they just find other ways. And, Minnesota at one point had these big billboards saying, we will take care of your womanly needs or whatever. We're going to be one of those states that is going to be a refuge for you, so you can come and have an abortion. However they phrased it, I don't remember. But yeah, those kinds of things have been kind of horrifying to watch, how basically instead of letting it sink in and maybe thinking about it a little bit more, it was just this rush to scramble to make sure women could have this access to be able to kill their children. And so that was happening all over the country. What are some of the other effects that you witnessed that you were maybe surprised at or just horrified by?
Well, I think we've seen really that abortion is very deeply entrenched in the American psyche, by which I mean I think we have a vision of equality and a vision of liberty and a vision of, frankly, what sex is for and what it's about that makes abortion necessary. And if you look at kind of what Americans believe about freedom and equality and what they believe about what men and women are and what sex is, it makes perfect sense that most people would generally think abortion should be legal because the sexual revolution really changed the way we think about sex. And now we think that it ought to be available to men and women, equally, no matter the circumstance, no consequences, no commitment necessary. And if that's what you believe about sex, then of course, pregnancy looks like an unfair consequence that is only on the shoulders of women, because it is, right? Women become pregnant and men don't. Although I suppose even that's a bit in debate these days. But in fact,
right.
women become pregnant and men don't. And so in a country where we believe that a key component of freedom and equality is, equal participation in sex with no consequences, you're always going to have abortion. And that's why the end of Roe did not end abortion. And in fact, we have more abortions now than we did before because we're living in a culture where people believe deeply in equality, as they should. But one aspect of that equality is that women need to be able to get rid of the consequences of sex because otherwise they can't be free and equal to men. And that's why, I kind of referenced what people were saying on my social media or in the broader media after Roe was overturned. And immediately the American mind goes to, well, now women aren't equal. Why? Because there's this underlying premise that we have to be able to have sex and walk away with no consequences. And we can't do that without abortion. Women can't do that. And so that's one of the big things we were trying to get at in our book is pro-lifers have to be better at explaining why abortion is bad for women too. Because if you don't understand that and you don't understand these deeper premises, Americans are always going to kind of think, well, I don't like abortion very much. I probably wouldn't do it myself. I wouldn't want my wife or my daughter or my girlfriend to do it. But if I were in a tough position, I kind of think it should be legal, right? There's this sort of loophole for me and people I care about, or a loophole for, the hard situation that I don't want to tell other people what to do. And that's how you end up with these ballot measures all across the country of people supporting legal abortion over and over and over again, even though about half of Americans still say they're pro-life on the whole. So
I know this is a hornet's nest, but just briefly, and we're going to go to break here in a little bit, but before we go to break, what would you say one solution would be to change? Because it seems impossible as you lay it out, and it's true. There's so many things. Another one is IVF, and there's so many babies that are being aborted that way. And yet we want that freedom, right? We want that choice. Where do we even begin, Alexandra, to somehow make sense of this in a way that we can begin to bring light to the topic? Is there it's going to be a long haul, I think, but do you have any thoughts of any kind of a solution, or what are your thoughts on that?
I think the more time I spend with this topic, the more I think that rebuilding a culture of marriage and family is ultimately the solution. And how we do that, of course, is a very difficult topic. I don't have a magic solution for how you go about building a culture of marriage and family, but I do think that's where we have to start because that's where we went wrong.
Yeah. Well, we're going to talk more about this topic. Did the fall of Roe help or hurt the pro-life cause with Alexandra DeSanctis after this break? We'll be right back.
Local news affects your life. It gives you the confidence and clarity to make better decisions every day. You can support that with a digital subscription. Visit inforum.com/subscribe to take advantage of our introductory offer, just $6 for 6 months.
We're back with Matters of Soul Importance, and we are talking about abortion and whether the fall of Roe v. Wade helped or hurt the pro-life cause. There's so many twists and turns here, and it's kind of been a mire, but lots of important topics. This is life and death, so it is the most important topic. Alexandra, I touched briefly on the IVF situation, and I want to mention that here because that is directly tied to our topic today. Do you want to go into a little bit about maybe like how we're not getting that IVF thing? It kind of is along the same lines of what you were saying earlier, that we want our freedoms, we want our choices, but what do people need to know about IVF? And it's a sensitive topic, I realize, but it's important we mention it.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot there. But I would just start by saying, of course, in this conversation, we always want to validate the desire of people to have children. I think it's a very natural and good thing to want to have children. And it's a great suffering when one can't for whatever reason. But I think our conversation around this is very misguided, and it comes from really the philosophical roots of the problem, I think, are entrenched in the fact of abortion, because it's the same mindset around children, which is that children are not human beings or persons in their own right, but rather almost a commodity or a product that we can either get rid of or obtain because we want them. And you hear this when, for example, I remember early on, either during the 2024 campaign or shortly after the inauguration, President Trump and the administration were talking about these different pro-IVF policies they wanted to put in place, and were describing how pro-life they were. The idea being, I guess, that, well, children are good and having children is life, and so therefore IVF is pro-life. But of course, anybody who's studied the issue knows it's not that simple for many reasons, one of which is, many of these children are indefinitely frozen and or killed in order for just even one child to come out into the world as a result of IVF. We can't just ignore that or paper that over because we don't happen to see those children in freezers, right? Those are human beings that exist somewhere or are killed just to produce this one human being. But even on a kind of deeper philosophical level, I think the problem with IVF is that it takes the creation of a human being out of the context of a loving union between that child's mother and father, which is the proper way for a child to come into the world. And it turns that child into just sort of an object or a commodity that somebody can order up, right? And we see this now more and more. It's not just, a man and a husband and wife who want to have children but can't using IVF. It's, same-sex couples or single parents who intend never to have a spouse or never to have a partner, just wanting a child and ordering one up. And I think there's something deeply wrong about bringing a child into the world to intentionally deprive that child of his or her mother and father. That's just deeply, deeply backwards and disordered to do that to a child. And it treats that child as though they exist to gratify the desires of the adult who went and ordered them up, right? Even if there are some good things about the desire of those adults, it's not right. And it's the same, it's kind of the flip side of the abortion coin.
Absolutely, yeah. And those children grow up and they start asking questions, and that can really cause havoc. We just don't think through things very well. We kind of have what we want and see what we want, and because we can do it, we do, without really asking what are the effects. And so in both of these scenarios, that's what's happening. And as you kind of hinted on the fact that, the Trump administration has kind of let us down a little bit in the pro-life movement, I think. There's been some different issues that I've been very disappointed in. Do you want to go into that a little bit about what should we be looking at if we're really going to be tackling these issues the best way possible, the good way, the true good and beautiful way? What should an administration, seek in trying to build this culture of life, basically?
Well, I think certainly you would expect a pro-life administration not to go out of its way to expand IVF, which is something that this administration has gotten wrong from the very beginning, even before the president was elected. I think we've also seen, unfortunately, a lot of efforts from this administration to stop pro-life states from regulating chemical abortions. They've actively, been involved in legal battles to block pro-life laws regulating chemical abortion. And then the biggest issue, which I kind of alluded to earlier, but during the Biden administration, the Health and Human Services Department relaxed safety regulations, health and safety regulations around chemical abortion drugs to make it easier for women to obtain chemical abortion drugs via mail without ever seeing a doctor in person. And this administration has not undone those policies. And in fact, despite a lot of lobbying, despite, various research and studies coming out showing that chemical abortion drugs are in fact even more harmful to women than the FDA currently discloses, things like this, the administration has very staunchly refused to undo those Biden-era policies, which are allowing, again, more than 2/3 of abortions now to take place across the country. And when they talk about this issue, the president and vice president both often say, well, Dobbs sent this issue back to the states. And we can just set aside for a moment the fact that I think actually it sent the issue back to the people and their representatives, which would include Congress. But even if you think that this is only a state issue, you can't really have state pro-life laws if they're undermined by federal policy, right? If your federal policy is allowing abortion drugs to be disseminated across all 50 states, you don't really have states settling their own policy on this. And so for the administration not only to refuse to have pro-life policy that it could very easily control, but also to repeatedly undermine pro-life states, I think is very disappointing.
That's a huge point. And that's what it feels like from our end. It feels like, well, there was this chance for us to maybe settle this within our states and get things right. But again, there's these workarounds and what is it that, because obviously an administration is supposed to be, beholden to the people. Are the people around the administration that are advising the president not understanding what they're doing here? I mean, where are we going off track where this is just getting pushed through like it's not a big deal?
Well, I think there might be some element of taking certainly pro-life voters and the pro-life base for granted and thinking, well, look, you got Roe v. Wade overturned. What more do you want from me? Just kind of leave me alone. I'm the hero, and pro-life groups do still often talk about, describe the president as the most pro-life president ever and the, kind of the hero of the movement for appointing the justices who ended up overturning Roe. And that's great, right? Like I said, that's a huge victory, and it isn't diminished by what has come after. But I do think you have to do more than that, right? That isn't the end of the story, and you have to have pro-life policy if you have control over that as president. That has to follow from it, and we can't have a long-term status quo in this country with 20 states protecting unborn children and 30 states not doing so, right? That's not a house divided against itself cannot stand. That's not a long-term solution here, particularly when federal policy is allowing women to obtain abortions, very without any safety policy making whatsoever. I think that's a very misguided to think that we can just kind of leave the issue there. And to your point about what advice they're getting, of course, I don't know exactly, but I do think there's a sense that, there's generally a loose pro-abortion status quo in public opinion. And I think that's generally true. And so if you don't want to make people too angry, it's probably pretty safe to say you support chemical abortion at this point. And unfortunately, I think we're seeing more people who once described themselves as pro-life moving in that direction and hoping not to face political consequences for it.
It just seems like it's too easy because it's kind of shrouded and it's behind. You don't see it as much. There's no abortionist to blame because the woman, she did it herself in her own home. So it just seems like there's more deceit in it. I want to talk a little bit about the women. You've talked about that. What have you seen about the effects of abortion on women? Because that's an important part of this conversation. And what have you seen as you've glimpse behind the curtain of what the devastation that this is causing?
Well, we have a whole chapter in the book on the effects of abortion on women. And I think the most important thing to keep in mind when we talk about this is that most women do not choose abortion in kind of an excited, happy way, right? Nobody goes out to get an abortion like they're getting a manicure. It's really a devastating thing that women do most often because they feel like they don't have another choice. And I think that piece is really missing from our conversations, although you do hear this even from people who support abortion, but they kind of don't follow on to the next step, which is, well, perhaps we ought to have a different solution, right? If women are in these hard situations and they don't want to choose abortion, why are we acting like this is a real solution, right? Why are we putting the full burden of pregnancy on women's shoulders and telling them, if you want out, you better go kill your own child? Is that really the best solution we can offer as a society? Is that actually good for women? But in terms of the effects on women who've had abortions, the research on this is really very obscured by the pro-abortion side. But there are long-term physical consequences for women, long-term psychological consequences. And when it comes to chemical abortion in particular, you'll see anecdotes more and more of women realizing what it is they've done when they see their unborn child in the toilet, right? To have done this yourself, I think that really... when you have an abortion via an abortionist, there's kind of this separation between you and what happened. And of course, women still suffer after the fact in those situations too. But to have been the one who took the drug yourself and to even see your child, I think that's obviously a very devastating thing to go through. And women are, of course, going to suffer after the fact.
And there's this underlying anger, I think, that kind of is swelling in our land of women that have gone through this and aren't being able to get healing because they've been convinced by society that it shouldn't be a big deal. They know internally at a deep level that it is, but they have to ignore that. And so I think what we see is this anger coming out. And even all those that helped, the fathers and also there's a thing about the fathers sort of relinquishing their responsibilities and how we have allowed that to happen. There's just so many issues here, and it's hard to know where to begin. One of the places you have begun is by you have a child. You're a mother. Tell us a little bit about how, if motherhood has changed anything. I'm sure it you were already pro-life by reason, by logic before that, but how has becoming a mother deepened your sense of this issue and the injustice that we're seeing everywhere?
Yeah, well, it certainly makes it a lot more personal, and it makes it a lot more heart-wrenching to think about women having abortions, not only because of, the fact of knowing that an unborn child is being killed in each of those instances, which is, I can just kind of feel that on a gut level as deeply wrong and deeply evil. But I also have a lot more compassion for women than I did before. And I've always really tried to cultivate that compassion towards women who choose abortion, because that's obviously the right thing to do, right? Women need compassion in that situation, as horrible as that act is. But I could really feel it on a visceral level. How dependent I was on my husband, how blessed I was to be in a situation where I didn't have to worry about the fact that I was pregnant, or, I couldn't imagine being in a situation where I actually had to consider abortion as a real option, or where that looked like the best solution. And there are women in that position. And so it really helped me to sort of feel on almost a bodily level the fact that there are women for whom this looks like a way out, and that it's not something that a woman would choose lightly, and it couldn't possibly be something that wouldn't affect a woman, or that they could just easily move on from, even if they maybe never put it in those words or are never able to heal from it. It would absolutely be something that would affect you for the rest of your life.
Yeah, I wish we could look forward and offer that glimpse into the future, but that isn't happening. What are your hopes, Alexandra, as you look into the future? You look into your child's eyes, and what world you want for your child. What are some hopes that you have on this issue, or anything else that you want to bring up in our discussion today?
Well, I guess the more I think about this issue, and certainly as I start to raise my own son, who's almost 1.5 now, it's just a sadness about what we've lost because of the sexual revolution, and a sadness about kind of the way men and women have learned to treat each other, the things that men and women have learned to think of as normal or perhaps inescapable, and how we relate to one another, the failures of marriages, the children who grow up with parents who aren't married, children who never know their father, children who may never know their mother or father now. That's all just absolutely heartbreaking stuff. And I think it's really important that we continue praying and working to bring about a better culture. But I'm not actually convinced that there is some way to go back. I don't know that you can put the sexual revolution cat back in the bag, so to speak. And so I think more and more my hope is to build a community and a church and a school and a place where families can thrive, and where children can grow up knowing what's true about human life, about human nature, about human sexuality, and at least, carve out space to live that sort of good life here, even if the culture around us never quite turns all the way around.
That kind of gets into what it might have on my thoughts here as far as where to take this conversation next, and that is to go into the faith realm, a little bit away from politics and into the faith. What does the church have to offer in this regard? Some of the teaching, some of the ways of thinking about the human person that you have been able to take into your conversations.
Well, I will say, everything that I do in my work is undergirded by the Catholic theology that I've learned my whole life. I think it would be very difficult to work on this issue without that understanding. And that's not to say that everything I write or my speaking talks about Catholicism explicitly, but the vision of the human person, what we were created for, the fact that we were created out of love by a God who wants us to spend eternity with him, right? All of that really undergirds and is, in my view, a necessary part of why I write about this issue, and what kind of the hope that the church offers to people who are enmeshed in this wrong way of thinking. But also just the kind of the hope that the church provides in terms of a better way of living in the midst of it, right? We know that life on earth is not all there is. And the goal is to live well here while we're on our way to eternity. So that that eternal perspective, trying to keep that eternal perspective, I think is really important when you do work like this or when you think about this issue.
Yeah, and earlier you're saying it's going to be hard to, you weren't sure how to build this new culture or whatever. But I think it's simple. It's the simple part of it is just loving those in our midst, right? And just being that model. I mean, because really we can't do a lot about all the other things. We can write about it. We can talk about it. We can try to educate people. We can, and that those are important things. And we can pray at an abortion facility, try to give literature, all that. But like you said, not everyone can do that. But we can all love the people that are in our lives. And I think that can be such a beautiful example. And I think you're right, too, about marriage. We're so broken in that regard. I'm in a marriage group called the Teams of Our Lady, and it's based on Henri Caffarel, who was very much into building marriages back in the 50s and 60s, I believe it was. And so he started these groups that meet, and it's such a beautiful, we meet once a month. We're actually going to meet tonight in one of our homes. We have dinner, we pray together, we read scripture together, we have different weekly commitments that we share about. They're called the Endeavors. And I just sometimes think that group we've only been part of it for a couple of years now, but it just seems like this just little light in the darkness. And even if nobody else knows about us, we're there praying for marriages and praying, strengthening each other's marriages through just camaraderie and support. And I think we need that because we are kind of isolated sometimes in our culture today, and we need each other to lean on and to learn from and to just have that accountability. So I don't know, I was just inspired to mention that because I think you're right. And so the more we can just be in our places and love others, be charitable towards others, speak truth in love, right? I think we can do what we can do because like you said, we don't have to carry this torch all the way. We just have our little part, our little time to do it. So what are some thoughts about what you're going to be doing to help the pro-life movement in the future? Are you still doing a lot of writing, and what other things are on your plate right now?
Yeah, I'm writing and speaking pretty regularly on this topic. Less so now because I'm focusing a lot on being home with my son, but I certainly do still, follow the issues and write about it pretty regularly. I think it's really important. I think we all have to do what we can where we are. And, you mentioned, I like to talk about the fact of maybe a little bit of a bleak fact, but back in the Roman Empire, it was very common for babies to be exposed, meaning newborns to be left out on trash heaps or out in the open to die when they were unwanted. And what Christians did in response to that was to go out and bring as many of those children as they could into their own homes and raise them as their own. And I think that's a really powerful witness to us as pro-lifers that, we don't have to go out and change the entire political and cultural landscape of the United States, right? The Christians were not overthrowing the Roman Empire. And yet, a few centuries later, the Roman Empire did fall. And at a certain point, infanticide was made illegal because of the Christians' witness in the Roman Empire. And so I think there's a lot of power in just those individual little acts to do what we can where we are.
There's a lot of power there, and I think we have to start there and just think small. Like Mother Teresa said, we have to just do what we can in our own homes, and that's how we can change the world. So, anything else? I guess I always circle back to the question: did the fall of Roe help or hurt the pro-life cause? What do you think, Alexandra?
Well, I think absolutely it helped the pro-life cause in the sense that it was always going to be impossible to make further progress on this issue for as long as Roe v. Wade was in place, right? That decision told us that our Constitution enshrined a right to abortion, which of course it never did. And so for the Supreme Court to have recognized that decision was wrong all along, that there's no protection for abortion in our Constitution, for that to be undone was a major victory and a necessary starting point for everything else the pro-life movement needs to do. But I think what we've seen since then is that there is far more work to be done than we expected. The culture we're operating in, the political landscape that we're operating in is perhaps even more challenging than we had anticipated. And those challenges probably look different than we might have predicted. So I think on the whole, we have to call it a victory, but really just the starting point of the fight.
Yeah, I sometimes when we have our mind on the prize, right, that we just are going for it, and we're just that's the goal, and we have no insight really as to how it's going to fall into place because we're so focused on the goal. And I think that's what happened. We were so excited and praying for this one thing, and then the ramifications came. But I agree with you. The fact that that was overturned and that the court saw no, that wasn't a right is huge. We now have that as a reality and a truth. And so we can have that as a starting point as we go into the future and try to make a sense of the muddle of what's happened afterwards. And again, just to keep our eyes on those small little things. Alexandra, it's been wonderful having you here. Wow, you're so insightful and you are on top of this issue. And I know even more you will do wonderful things as you go out into the world, and especially as you raise your son and any children that might come after this. So thank you so much for taking time with us today. I appreciate it so much. Did the fall of Roe help or hurt the pro-life cause? In Alexandra's co-authored book, Tearing Us Apart, we confront this truth in the chapter Abortion Harms Women and the Family. Abortion treats pregnancy as a disease and treats the male body as the norm, disadvantaging women because of their natural role in the reproductive process. In the workplace, such a mindset lends itself to a corporate culture within which women must behave like men to succeed. Instead of accommodating women's natural capacity for childbearing and often natural desire for child rearing, a culture that permits abortion encourages women to behave like career-focused men, delaying marriage and childbearing and minimizing the negative effects of childbearing and parenthood on workplace performance. The paragraph goes on explaining that a society that treats abortion as an acceptable solution to unplanned pregnancy is less likely to prioritize positive goals and spousal support for women who are raising children, and greater workplace opportunity compatible with family life, including more flexibility in employment. Notice nothing has been said here about the real and deep mental, emotional, physical, and even spiritual impacts on women and men, which we know are vast and deep and are covered elsewhere in the book. Those effects are the real lived-out implications on the woman's psyche, but the wider negative effects on communities and families exposed in this section provide a wider view of how we are all impacted by abortion negatively. What Alexandra and Ryan are revealing in just this small excerpt is that this is not a private decision and that our entire society is responsible for how we've allowed the tragedy of abortion to weaken our world, making it less humane and hospitable on every level possible. That section ends this way. Law and policy grounded in an anthropology that takes seriously the realities of human embodiment would view both pregnant mothers and their unborn children as vulnerable, dependent members of society who are entitled to the protection of the law. Not only that, but they, like all of us, are entitled to our support to rely on the networks of giving and receiving that all human beings need to survive and flourish. This Wednesday, June 24th, will mark the 4th anniversary of the Dobbs versus Jackson Supreme Court case, which reversed the very wrong decision of Roe v. Wade nearly 50 years prior. Like Alexandra said, this reversal was a major victory, and we all ought to continue celebrating the rectification of such a damaging decision. And yes, the aftermath has been hard, but we have life on our side and the Lord of life who has conquered death. So let us not be discouraged, but like all the heroes in the Bible and the heroic saints since, let us continue on in our good work to end this scourge once and for all. One quick note before I go today. I've included a link in the show notes to a piece I wrote for the National Catholic Register the year of Roe's fall, in which I interviewed Alexandra by phone. The article is focused on her friend, Erica Bakioki, who shares Alexandra's passion for pro-life issues. Well, in a couple of weeks, we'll turn in a slightly different direction to ask the question, can a home have a soul? Until then, don't lose sight of the light.